All right, let's do a fun video explaining the biggest political farce, economic farce of my lifetime, the national debt and deficit, which Infographics just did a piece on. So let's look at it.
Paying off the entire debt now would cause an avalanche of problems. For starters, what would the Fed use to manage inflation and unemployment? It could no longer sell securities. And what about Social Security and banks all over the world? What safe asset would they invest their consumers' and pensioners' money into if not U.S. Treasury securities?
Let's just clarify what we mean when we say pay off the national debt, because this video is supposed to explain what the national debt is and how you could pay it off, if we should pay it off, if it's a problem at all. Those are the things I want to answer in this video. So when he says pay off the national debt, there's two mechanisms we can use to do that. One of them is we can put the entire treasury stock on the Fed's balance sheet, and then in accordance with what MMT, modern monetary theory, prescribes, you'd have a conjoining of the treasury and the Fed so as to stop the further issuance of any treasury securities in the future. Option two, which I'm in favor of, far less volatile, is just stopping the issuance of treasury securities altogether. Now, that's the scenario that Infographics is tackling here. They're like, there's no more treasury securities out in the stock. So what kind of issues is that going to cause? Well, first issue they point out is the Fed can't use interest rates to fight inflation. And that's a complete misunderstanding of how the Fed currently, in excess reserves, manages interest rates. They pay they pay on the excess reserve balance. It's called interest on reserve balance. That is how the overnight rate is controlled. They do not do open market operations because it would be useless. There's too many reserves in the system, right? And if the Fed had no balance sheet, there would be no reserves in the system, and interest rates would approach infinity. So this whole idea that the Fed is intervening and that it is not natural for the Fed to have a balance sheet is idiotic. Actually, the unnatural thing for a sovereign nation to do is to issue securities, which is why we should let them all expire and not issue any more. I struggle to see the public purpose in having all of these securities outstanding and us paying interest income to the wealthiest Americans and the wealthiest foreigners. I'm all in favor of a bigger deficit, but if you're going to do a deficit, then do it in a way that benefits the people who extract more utility from their consumption. The people with demand curves that are not completely vertical, like wealthy people's are, right? If you look at the supply and demand graph of our domestic economy, you have the median, right, of the demand slope, and then you have the average worker down here, super shallow, intersects at a very low quantity, and then you have the wealthiest people who, according to recent stats, do a ton of consumption, right? Their consumption is like half, I believe. The top 10% did 50-60% of consumption. Top 1%, it was very significant. Their demand curve looks like this, and it's way over to the right. That is materially how wealth inequality decreases living standards, but it is not wealth inequality. I think that's an inaccurate way of describing it. It's more so consumption inequality. So what are these financial institutions then? On to his next point. What are these financial institutions and world actors going to do with their $37 trillion that are not time deposited away in an interest-bearing securities account at the Fed, right? They are now it's like they have the dollars in a checking account instead of in a securities account. So what are they going to do with them? If the world financial sector is functional, which I believe it is, then they will make rational choices with how to use that liquidity, right? Most of it's probably going to go into equities. People are going to say the equities are going to be overvalued then. It's like, well, how do you know if an equity is overvalued, right? An equity, is just really society using its currency to buy itself back, right? So there's no such thing as an overvalued stock market. There is relative value and there's relative overvaluation, but there's no such thing as an S&P 500 that's overvalued. So that's one thing. One issue that could arise is if all these people just start buying, triple C rated bonds. That is not a good idea, and we should not forego the risk calculations that are necessary for a functional global financial sector. And I believe that will maintain, and we do not need these arbitrary securities outstanding to maintain this financial sector, right? People say treasuries are the only pristine collateral, so we must have them. It's like replacing those treasuries, the pristine collateral, with the pristine liquidity, dollars, is not going to cause a disaster. If anything, it's going to cause the opposite of a disaster. Liquidity is always preferential, and the only reason you have pristine collateral in the first place is to have access to pristine liquidity, right, in the reserve currency.
At the moment, no similar financial instrument or safe investment exists. Now the national debt careening out of control will also undermine Treasury securities. And that's why it's in our interest to lower the debt and not eliminate it entirely.
That's also false. The debt could be 10 million % of GDP. We could issue $30 quadrillion of treasuries tomorrow, and we would not see a long-term bear steepener on the yield curve. It's basic finance. This is what people do not understand. They're like, if our national debt's gonna keep growing, well, won't the interest rates on the long end of the curve also grow? It's like, well, they're definitely not gonna grow on the short end, because the Fed guarantees the short end. If they didn't guarantee the short end, then we'd have no money, right? Because what's the shortest end security? $1, right? That wouldn't exist if the Fed didn't have a balance sheet. They guarantee that end. They guarantee whatever their 3-month rate is, right? Otherwise, everything would be infinity. So they're going to control the short end. The long end is purely a function of the short end. The long end is in no way independent, right? There's instances where markets, because they're not perfect, and short-term markets will have these dynamics where supply is a factor. But long run, in the debt market, supply won't matter because of arbitrage. The Fed must guarantee the short end. If the long end starts rising in a bear steepener, which is when the yield curve goes like that, there's an arbitrage opportunity, and financial institutions can borrow short, lend long, bring the long end of the yield curve down. The Fed has to bring more treasuries onto their balance sheet to maintain the short end, and the yield curve goes unchanged long term. That is the main theory there. So, strike. I've yet to hear a reason why paying off the national debt is bad. And I'm surprised he even entertains that idea, because usually these people who haven't thought about it are like, oh, it's impossible to pay off the national debt. We'd have to have government savings of $37 trillion like a household would to pay off its debt.
As Professor Kyle says, that would be an international catastrophe for which there is no precedent for a major reserve currency of the world. We don't know exactly what would happen, but it won't be good.
If we defaulted, that is very much true. If we phase out the treasury security as a financial asset, there's no evidence for that at all. Because we're not stealing, we're not replacing value, we're injecting $37 trillion of liquidity, right? That is in no way this kind of like Armageddon-like scenario, right? Remember, we're literally just moving dollars from a time deposit to a non-time deposit. And the time deposit happened to have an interest-bearing element to it, right? The checking account, which is a non-time deposit, can also have an interest-bearing element to it. That's what IORB is, interest on reserve balance. That's how the Fed manages rates, as I just said. It is like a checking account that bears interest, and that's what binds our interbank rates. But yeah, no, this would never be defaulting on the debt would do this. So Professor Kyle was right that if we just make all these securities worth nothing instantly, that would be financial Armageddon. Probably World War III, probably the next coronavirus pandemic. Everything bad would happen. The fact that it's used as political negotiations or like some kind of job owning is disgraceful.
What's more important than the total amount of debt is the debt to GDP ratio. Though government debt and personal debt functions very differently in some ways, you still don't want to owe way more money than you make. And that's why the US paid $345 billion in interest in 2020 and $659 billion in 2023, just 3 years later. And
so he admitted that government debt is not like household debt, but I'll put a little bit of a qualifier on that. It's not that government debt is not the same as household debt. It's that it's the exact opposite. It's literally the opposite. Look at sectoral balances, sectoral flows, right? A public sector deficit is a private sector surplus. If you as a household want savings to pay off your debt, you must have the government incur debt, because you only net save because there is a deficit, right? Unless you're on a gold standard or whatever, or you like are accounting in some weird ways where you're extracting like raw materials or you're saving in a non-currency form, right? We don't count that as financial net savings, but we operate in a financial economy where money is extremely important. We can change living standards just by printing more money or by suffocating the economy of money, because the economy is infinitely more efficient with money, therefore it depends on it. So de facto, net savings must result in a government debt. Therefore, when you see the debt clock, it might as well be called the savings clock. There's no difference. So, household debt is the exact opposite.
$892 billion in 2024, making U.S. payments for its debt interest higher than the entire U.S. military budget. The good news is this doesn't.
So just put interest rates to zero. I agree. That is disgraceful. We should not be paying out this interest money to foreigners and to wealthy Americans and financial institutions. There's just no point. In countries with foreign exchange problems, it actually drives inflation. Right? We see that in Turkey. We see that in Argentina. The idea that having these ultra high interest payments to the private sector, the idea that that's going to cure inflation while the government is printing, half its GDP in interest payments and flooding the private sector with money that it immediately goes to the foreign exchange markets and dumps onto it, selling its own currency. Like, that is a horrible solution to inflation. The solution to inflation is nothing. It's to have a deficit that is high enough to account for the inflation. It is to have a functional domestic economy. Every single case of hyperinflation included a decimated economy, an economy that was not diversified, an economy that was already in shambles. Look at the Soviet Union, for a good example. Look at really any post-World War II economy that experienced hyperinflation. Look at Zimbabwe. It's all the same. The economy first suffers before hyperinflation, because then, and only then, does the private citizens of that country have an inelastic demand for imports that keep them alive. And they cannot pay for those imports with exports, so what do? They flood the foreign exchange market with tons and tons of their currency to try and fool foreigners into taking these massive payments in like Zimbabwean currency, just to feed their citizenry, right? That's what all these governments have in common and experience hyperinflation. It's your economy is too poor to feed your people's needs, so you print a ton of money to engage in trade that your net value as a nation does not pay for. If I can explain that, if I explain that well.
Here that we're anywhere near the entire world losing full faith in the US government's ability to keep up its debt payments or in the future of its economy. So it seems even the astronomical debt the country is in at the moment is okay for now. But there are some troubling signs on the horizon. For starters, 2025 was one of the first times that a shock to the stock market was followed by a decrease in the purchase of US Treasury bonds. Normally there's an increase. As former director of the Congressional Budget Office Douglas Holtz-Eakin states, this was basically unprecedented. Money fled from the U.S. for safety instead of to the U.S. for safety.
That is because in April, remember that was Liberation Day. What happened to treasuries? Of course, we expected more inflation because of the tariffs. Now, that inflation isn't necessarily showing up as much as we thought. So, these yields were rising. People were selling off treasuries. And of course, if you hold an auction while that is happening at such a fast rate, the auction will be looser. It's not like that we couldn't sell them, right? If you notice yields, they're still in a pretty tight range. Nothing to do with the supply of treasuries. It's just in a short amount of time, if you have immense selling pressure and you try and enter that market, try and get people to buy, it's going to be a looser scenario, right? And there could be fear components that drive the market yield away from the arbitrage, ideal yield, the correct yield for a few days. But long run, it will always return to that mathematical yield.
For the first time in my memory, see, people generally invest heavily in U.S. Treasury bonds in times of crisis because they're considered such a safe investment. So when the stock market is seen as volatile, people buy up bonds instead. Surprisingly, for most economists, that is not what happened this time, which may also explain why the U.S. dollar keeps losing value against other currencies like the euro. And it may explain why 11 countries stopped using the U.S. dollar as their reserve currency. All of that means, even though the U.S. is
Yeah, there has been a flight from the dollar, and that is not good. That means that import prices are going to be higher relative to what they would be if the dollar had not lost all of this value. I don't know what's causing it. I think that there's sufficient demand globally for dollars that it will be the reserve currency for as long as we are alive. But it will weaken during that time because there's going to be less incentive for countries to use it because they're realizing that, having a currency, having your own sovereign currency being, settled in is very good for business, for living standards, etc. It is one of the most effective things you as a country can do to raise your citizenry, raise the living standards of your citizenry. It gives you better terms of trade, essentially.
Still generally seen as a solid economy, international actors have lost some faith in the country's stability and future. And as multiple economists have warned, the debt isn't much of a problem until it is. And then it can suddenly become a huge one. Paying off the national debt might sound...
So I don't know if he explains in this video what the mechanism he prescribes for paying off the debt is. I mean, I would be interested for that. I'm not patient enough to watch the whole thing. I just kind of skipped to the conclusion where he goes over the spark notes because my attention span is too small. That's pretty much it though. Interesting topic though. I like talking